So the See Inside this week does fit into our timeline here in the late 90s, but honestly, this is a story that, historically speaking, could have kind of taken place at any point, and I did want to include it just as kind of a look at the issue of right to life, or more specifically, right to die. So it does focus on a true story of this guy who was injured in, his early 20s or mid-20s, and kind of breaks his neck while he's diving into shallow water. Is it seriously like 20 years that he's been like this when we meet him in the movie?
Yeah, I think it's like 26 or 27 years by the time the movie's over.
Right. And so he's completely quadriplegic. He has some movement with his mouth, so they give him like a little stick and he can talk, which is nice, but then other stuff he can adjust his settings in his bed with little mouth control and stuff like that. But other than that, he's completely reliant on everybody else for all his needs. And he's gotten to the point where he would like to end his life, but he can't, since all he can do is move his head a little bit and his mouth, he's not even capable of killing himself. So he would need assistance. And that's kind of what the whole movie is. This is set in Spain, where it's illegal. And actually, we'll get to the details. It's actually still illegal in most of the world, it seems like, for even assisted suicide.
Assisted suicide is, Which, and I don't... Did you look into the actual true story? Like, how similar is it to... I just know that it's based on a true story, but I don't know how much of the movie is accurate, how much of the movie, how much it follows, or if it's just the basic premise of the guy.
Yeah, I'm going to guess it feels pretty close, but it's also such a small story that you go to, like, again, the Wikipedia page here for the guy who Javier Bardem plays, and it's a very short page. It's just here's a guy who's in the situation. So I'm going to say that is all correct. And the method of suicide that he ultimately does succeed with does seem to be correct. But as far as the details of the characters we meet there, it's honestly not even public information where we would know the details about this family life.
Okay.
And the book that he writes in the movie, that's real, but like it doesn't look like it's even available outside of Spanish language. So you can buy it on Amazon, but just in Spanish. So it wasn't even, I don't know how good it is, but it wasn't popular enough to cross over to ever get published into English, even with this movie being, 10 years old.
And even in the movie, the book it's not like a biography, and I don't even think he's necessarily writing about wanting to kill himself. It's just a poetry book.
Right.
It's just like a book of his poems.
Right, and that is what's on Amazon. It's kind of just a book of his poetry, which is still neat that he was able to get this written while he was quadriplegic, obviously with the help of others, and it's still just kind of neat to be able to produce that. But yes, then ultimately he recruits the one girl in the movie, and again, I don't know about the details of who specifically helped him in real life, but it was kind of this collection of friends and family.
Mm-hmm.
It is interesting in the film, so the character that ultimately helps him, actually, I got confused already. So was it the Rosa, or actually it was the other girl that ended up helping him, right? Or did it end up being Rosa? He asked multiple people, and they all kind of had different feelings about it, and so I forget who ultimately helped him in the end. It was Rosa, right?
Is Rosa was the girl that worked in the factory and had the kids?
Yes, who kind of just met him as like almost a fan kind of thing.
Right, because she initially went to go talk to him because she heard him saw him on the TV.
Right.
And went to his house to try and convince him that he had stuff to live for. And he basically kind of shut her down and said, "You didn't come here to try and save me. You only came here to try and give your life purpose. You don't actually care about me or want me to change my mind." But that's just their first meeting. They end up becoming like good friends. And then she eventually comes around and says, "Well, I do love you. I do care about you. And because of that, I understand that this is what you want. And so I will." I think that they don't explicitly show it, but I think that she does end up helping, because he says, I have he either needed 4 people or he already had 4 people, but he needed one more to help him with his plan, because he had this whole process that he was going to use to where it was multiple people helping him, to where no one person was doing anything that was technically illegal. But by the end of the process, it ends up with a glass of cyanide poison next to his bed with a straw in it that's next to his mouth.
Right, and I'm looking on the actual real life guy's Wikipedia page. So it does say a close friend named Ramona was arrested. So obviously that makes you think then the people in the movie are more of amalgamations, because there was no Ramona in the movie.
Right.
So she was arrested and charged with assisting his suicide. But so what they showed in the movie with him dividing all the tasks up so that no one person had done anything illegal enough to be in trouble, that's what actually happened. So they divided each step up enough so the girl that was arrested ended up getting released for lack of evidence, and then there were no other charges ever filed. So his kind of way to skirt the legal system did ultimately work, because the idea is, okay, well, yes, if someone prepares a poison for me and sets it next to me and I drink it, they definitely could be charged with assisted suicide. Oh, but if one person pours the drink and it's just water, I poured a drink of water. Someone else happens to put something that's on the counter in the kitchen. Well, that's a different person. That's all they did. That wasn't intended for anybody. I thought it was going to go down the drain. And the next person brings a cup. They can say they don't know what's in it and set it next to you. And so you can kind of divide it up so no one person is guilty of helping you, and that's ultimately how he was able to pull it off. And we've kind of jumped through the whole movie very quickly, but we knew that was going to happen because this is just a super small story, but it is about a topic I kind of wanted to address.
Yeah.
And we kind of maybe just talk more about that.
Well, so before we get to that, one thing that I did like that they made very clear in the movie is multiple times they address, people are like, well, how can you say that, people that are quadriplegic don't deserve to live? And he says, well, that's not what I'm saying at all. Even when he's talking to the priest, he says, if you want to have the wheelchair and you want to live your life and you're fine with living your life that way, that's fine. Like, I'm not making a blanket statement about all quadriplegics. I don't want to live this way.
Right.
And I am not able to end my life by myself. So I should have the legal right to be assisted in that. He's not saying that, being a quadriplegic is so bad that, no one should have to live with it. That's not what he's saying at all. He doesn't want to keep living that way.
Right. And honestly, it kind of ties into our episode on abortion when you think about bodily autonomy.
Yes.
And it's a tricky thing because it seems like most people do support it if someone is terminally ill or in a quadriplegic state, but it does become arguably more of a slippery slope. If it's someone who's just dealing with depression, we kind of do want to make sure that it's stopped and we're actually treating the problems as opposed to, finding ways to allow them to die. And it is kind of maybe a little more problematic when society writ large doesn't feel it's quote unquote justified. I don't know. It's kind of a tricky topic.
Right. But at the same time, like I don't know, I think that suicide and mental illness, or even, I'm saying mental illness. I think that
you can count depression as a mental illness.
Right, but wanting to die it's like people automatically say, well, that means that you're insane. It means that you have a mental illness. It means that it's just gotten it's so medical. Like, society in general does not consider suicide to be a rational response to anything.
I would agree with that.
Even if there are people who can, in a rational way, might not necessarily be mentally ill, quote unquote, say that they just don't want to keep living. And should they have that right, or should society stop them?
And it is tricky though, because I guess I haven't crunched the numbers on this, but I guess my understanding is that it's way more suicides or attempted suicides are not from just people who are circumstantially in hard times. They literally have a chemical imbalance in their brain that could be addressed with medication. So I'm not saying that, I guess you're right, they should have the right to, but at the same time, shouldn't society be able to step in and get them the help they need so where that feeling goes away if possible?
Sure. Yeah.
Which doesn't take away their rights. It's just basically trying to help them find another solution that hopefully would be acceptable to them were they to undertake it.
Right.
But yes, I ultimately am kind of, people should be free to do what they would like, even if that means ending their life. But just, you would hope that it's a last resort, because once you go that route, there is no coming back. And so you want them to have had every opportunity. And that's where I think you would hope society would step up, is to provide those opportunities. And you get into the whole making sure we destigmatize mental health issues as far as getting help for them and talking about them.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing.
And also just provide better care. It's not illegal to kill yourself. It's not illegal to want to kill yourself. But if you express those ideations, then you can be, petitioned to have your freedom taken away, where you are picked up, not necessarily arrested, but you have your freedom taken away from you and you're sent to a psych ward that may or may not have the best quality of care. And then it's almost like, well, now you're punishing someone rather than trying to help them. It's almost like you're saying, well, if you have these, suicidal ideations, you're going to have to go to this state-run mental health facility. And then it's more like you're using that as a deterrent, like you're using the threat of punishment rather than you're actually trying to help people. And not that I have a solution for that.
No, right.
That's just...
And I like to hope we've moved on. And that makes me think of like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or something. And I hope we've moved on from that. But yeah, probably I'm thinking that more naively. And it's a resource thing. It's, as a society, we don't throw enough resources toward those kinds of things. And I think it's getting better, but it's definitely not where it could be or should be.
Right.
The other issue I wanted to talk about, and I brought it up to you before, was the Terry Schiavo. Yeah, Terry Schiavo. Yeah, Terry Schiavo case. And I was, peripherally familiar with this just from it being kind of in the news about 15 years ago, but I didn't realize how long she was in a essentially vegetative state.
It was like 15 years.
Yes, 15 years.
And that case is a little different from this one.
Correct, because she wasn't conscious.
Right, she wasn't conscious, and she there was no living will. Like she didn't have a living will saying, if I am brain dead, I don't want to continue living. Basically, it was a legal battle between her husband, who said, no, she told me that this is what, she didn't want to live this way. And her family said, well, we want her to keep living. We don't want to remove her feeding tube. And so it was, kind of a legal battle between the two of them.
Right. That ultimately took 15 years to get resolved before they allowed the feeding tube. Because you had to get court orders allowing the feeding tube to be removed, and then that she could die. But again, she was basically not conscious of any of this for 15 years.
And it was removed and then put back. That's true. At least once.
Right.
Where a court would say, all right, you can, you're allowed to remove the feeding tube, and then another court, there was a law passed or something that said, no, you got to put it back. That's not.
Well, that's sad in a whole different way, is because it's still kind of a right to die issue, but she has no idea what's going on, and so it's like it's almost even like, how are we even defining life? How is Terry Schiavo even alive for those last 15 years?
Well, and there was again a lot of controversy because her family, like her parents and her siblings, were releasing videos to the news media that they were saying, well, this is evident. Look at her; she's reacting to whatever, like her mother talking to her, listening to music, and so you can see she is conscious at least to a degree. And apparently the videos were very misleading, and it was more of reflex actions going on than actual consciousness, because then when she died and had an autopsy was done, an examination of her brain did show that there was no way that she could have been conscious at all, and that there was no way that she was ever going to recover, which those are kind of separate things. The not going to recover, like I think that her family would probably say, well, that didn't matter, that it didn't matter whether she was going to recover or not. We still wanted, to keep her alive, but she was not aware of any of what was going on for those 15 years.
It is interesting though, too. I remember hearing, and I didn't have this pulled up, but I remember hearing of a case a few years back of a person who was in a extended coma, like years, and was actually conscious but catatonic. Like, they were aware of people coming in and out of the room and people talking to them, but they just couldn't give any signal at all. They couldn't blink. They couldn't. And it was just like, so everyone thought they were completely in a coma, and they were actually conscious and unable to do anything about it, and like talk about a nightmare there. And that's almost one. And I guess obviously the only reason we know about it is they must have ultimately come out of it and said, like, no, I knew exactly what was going on the whole time. Right. That's a whole different kind of nightmare.
And that's, it's kind of an interesting thing that, with now better technology, there are laws, that kind of describe what a person's, how a person medically meets the threshold for being in a quote unquote vegetative state. But even people who are in a what would be legally defined as a vegetative state, they are now able to show with like certain medical imaging technology. Some of them still harbor at least a little bit of consciousness. So they'll put people in, in a brain scanner and ask them questions or ask them to imagine doing certain things like playing a sport or, walking around their house or something, and they'll see like coordination centers in the brain, activate, or, spatial navigation centers will activate, showing that they are at least able to like get input and then activate centers of the brain, like they're thinking about it, even if they are physically unable to do anything.
Right. Or not even conscious of it. It's still the brain at some level is reacting to the stimulus.
Right.
And again, it's despite the movie, and it kind of definitely tugs at the heartstring, and it's this weird thing where I guess you're rooting for the guy to die in a sense because that's what he wants, but at the same time you kind of maybe do hope he would change his mind, because the fact that he can communicate, you're hoping that he would, kind of like Rosa throughout the movie is hoping he will come around and be okay with just being able to interact through talking, and
right,
you can still have that mental and intellectual engagement with people for the rest of your natural life. But yes, it is still largely illegal. There are a handful of countries in Europe where it is now allowed, and there's only 7 or 8 states in the U.S. and plus D.C. that allow it, and it is illegal then in 40-some states still in the United States. So this is still a controversial thing that's largely not allowed, and it's tricky, and I think still, I don't know, I guess it's probably something that no politician is going to want to advocate necessarily. So it's not like there's a big push for it. It's such a niche thing where talking about such a small population, obviously, that fits this criteria where they're basically terminally ill and also then medically incapable of killing themselves.
Right.
I mean, I actually had a elderly great uncle, my dad's uncle, who I think had like emphysema and ended up killing himself 20 years ago. But again, so I didn't fall with any of these laws, though. He was able to take actions into his own hands and in his life that way. And yeah, I mean, it's sad, but again, when you're someone who's in constant pain, it's like, and actually I watched a TED Talk on YouTube about this very issue, and the guy talked about how we're totally okay with putting down beloved family pets because it's the humane thing to do because they're in pain, but then we don't treat humans with that same reverence almost, and it's this insistence that life is always better. And I'm not even necessarily making, I mean, I guess I'm kind of implying that I'm making a judgment, but it's at least it's a debate worth having that I feel like we don't talk about enough, even though most of us probably do err on the side of, oh, well, they're in a better place now, or they don't feel any pain anymore, and we're okay because it was for the best. We all seem to accept that, but the idea that then the medical establishment would help assist in that transition is still outlawed. It's just, I don't know, it's just kind of interesting where the laws don't necessarily match the public sentiment.
Which, and I think that this highlights, the necessity for people to get a living will.
True.
Because had Terry Schiavo had a living will that said, this is what I want, then there would have been no question. There would have been no need for 15 years of debate and going back and forth and
correct.
Lawmakers getting involved. And actually in 2005 or in the early 2000s, when they were at the end of Terry Schiavo's life and when it was like real big in the news, there was like a big increase nationwide of people getting living wills.
Oh, okay.
So that's, that is one good thing that came out of that situation. But yeah, it's important that you make your wishes known as to what you want to happen. If God forbid you end up incapacitated or in a vegetative state. Yeah.
Now, of course, again, though, back to the whole See Inside film, that doesn't address the assisted suicide issue for someone who is just physically incapable of killing themselves.
And that's why I think I think the assisted suicide thing is an easier discussion to have. Euthanasia is harder, in the absence of a living will. What are you supposed to do?
Because you don't know the person's wishes.
Because you don't know the person's wishes, right? And it's hard to balance between, well, should we, do we end someone's life or do we let them keep on living, even if it's not a way that they would have wanted to live, or, if they're, a burden on their family. I think there's a lot more gray area there than if it's assisted suicide and, the person wants to end their life and they're just physically unable to do so. I think it's easier to argue that they should have the bodily autonomy to be able to do that if they want to.
Right.
Just because, if they have that, if they're able to communicate, if they're conscious, and like our guy in the movie.
Right. And then another tangential issue that comes to mind is I've heard the vast majority of doctors, like, 90% of doctors or more, are all like, oh yeah, do not resuscitate me. Like they've seen it all. They know it's just basically prolonging suffering. And so most doctors will even say, like, yeah, don't even do CPR on me. Just let it, if I'm at that state, just let me go. And I just thought it was kind of fascinating to see that. I don't have that study in front of me, but I have heard that multiple times. So the movie itself, this was the Oscar winner for Best Foreign Language Film out of Spain for movies from 2004. And it was also nominated for Best Makeup. Javier Bardem was not that old at the time, and they aged him up in a way that did look very realistic. He was probably the age of the younger version. And then,
right, I was going to say in the scenes where he's on the beach, where that it shows him diving, like having the accident that ends up paralyzing him, like that's what he actually looks like. Right. So when you see the difference, it's like, whoa, he looks like he's in his 50s or 60s.
Right. He would have been like 35, 36 when the movie was made.
And I was curious, just because the technical aspects of movie making always kind of intrigued me, which I didn't look into this very much. But when they show him, on the bed, like without the blankets and stuff on, and there's the kind of his body is, his limbs have atrophied and everything. I'm wondering how they achieved that, because it's obviously not his real body. But is that that makeup? Is that a dummy that his head is kind of behind? Is that CGI?
That's a good question, because this obviously isn't a very high budget movie, so you wouldn't think they would have, especially in 2004, have an extensive budget to digitally atrophy him. But at the same time, man, it almost seems hokey if it was like a dummy body on top. So I don't know. That's a good question. I would say maybe it was just kind of mildly digitally edited at that time, but I don't know for sure. The film is an 84% on Rotten Tomatoes, and what's interesting too is I was kind of confused because the translation is actually a hair off. Did you notice that? So like when they show the title of the movie on screen, this is a Spanish film, it says Mar Adentro. Well, and that kind of means more out to sea, but I'm guessing they didn't want to keep that title because there was a 1997 comedy with Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon called Out to Sea.
And that's pretty common in these foreign films, that especially with the title will not be a direct one-to-one.
Which I get when things have a different connotation in different countries, but I feel like calling this Out to Sea, if it didn't call to mind that comedy, would seem appropriate. But The Sea Inside is a good title. I'm not saying I'm against the title, but it's just not what it translates as. So the one other thing, just because we don't have another film addressing, say, capital punishment in our timeline, I wanted to maybe just reflect on that a little bit as we're kind of talking about what the government's role is when it comes to death of its citizens, whether assisted suicide and the outlawing of that, or conversely, punishing criminals. So a movie I want to mention, we're not going to make it a full episode, and I don't know if you've even seen this movie, but Dead Man Walking is kind of a really good movie when it comes to dealing with the role of capital punishment. Susan Sarandon does play a real-life nun/nurse who was meeting with a couple different death row inmates, and they kind of combined those two guys into one, played by Sean Penn for the film. And it is a really good movie. I would recommend. It kind of peripherally ties into what we're talking about today.
So I've never seen Dead Man Walking. What is? I mean, I know that it's a movie about the death penalty, more or less. But is she trying to get Sean Penn off of death row, or what's?
So that kind of becomes maybe a little bit a part of it. But I think most again, it's been actually a while since I've seen this movie. But mostly, she's just trying to give these guys peace and give them a spiritual presence while they're awaiting the death sentence to come through. And I think through talking to him, she does start to maybe think he might be innocent. And again, that's kind of an amalgamation of two different guys. And I guess, spoiler alert for a movie you haven't seen, but I also haven't seen in 15 years and don't necessarily remember with the best of detail. But kind of one of the scenes, almost like the climax scene, is him finally confessing to her that he did it, after she's kind of realized that maybe he's been putting her on and trying to maybe get her to become an advocate for getting him off death row by convincing her that he's innocent when he obviously knows full well he did it, and him kind of breaking down and crying as she kind of calls him out for saying, like, you did this, didn't you? And he's like crying. He's like, yeah, I did. So, and I think one of them won the Oscar. Yeah, Susan Sarandon won the Oscar for Best Actress, and Sean Penn was nominated. So it's a really, really good movie, really powerful movie, does deal with the death penalty. And so I wanted to at least mention that as kind of being tangentially related to what we're talking about here today. I've been fervently anti-death penalty for basically my entire life, and it's because I don't see any justification for it from a few key factors. One, the way the process goes with all the court stuff that you have to go through to get someone on death row, it's more expensive to execute a prisoner than it is to keep them in prison for 50 years. So right off the bat, from a taxpayer dollar standpoint, you're actually saving money by not executing people. And this idea that the government has a role in giving the victims closure or punishing them by this eye for eye kind of thing, I just don't buy it. I think you remove them, you can put them in prison for life, but I think executing them is just not justified, especially when it comes to my final problem with it is we have, for a fact, in this country, executed innocent people.
Yes.
So if we've done that once, that's abolished the whole thing then because we can't do it right. Just, there's no excuse for it.
I used to be very pro death penalty, and the reason was because of a kind of you want to see people punished in a way fitting for their crime. So if they kill someone or they do something, some crime especially heinous, then I would say that they deserve to die.
Okay.
And I still think that, and I mean it makes perfect sense now thinking about this, but it didn't at the time. But you can think both. You can think that there are people who can commit crimes that 100% they deserve to die, and like absolutely they have, they should be killed, they should be removed from the earth, they don't deserve to continue living. However, I don't think that the government should be allowed to say that a government shouldn't be allowed to put its citizens to death for committing crimes. And that's a huge reason, is because even with the advances in crime scene technology and the fact that, with investigative techniques and forensic science, it's a lot easier to, catch criminals now. And it's a lot easier to know in a lot of cases whether or not someone has committed a crime. But just because we have better tools doesn't mean that they're not still being used by people, and people are flawed and people make mistakes. And so if because the justice system is, in the end, it's run by and made up of people, you end up executing innocent people. And I think that that's just about the worst thing that a government can do.
Right.
So, and there's a ton of arguments too that that people can make, like, well, it's a deterrent.
But it's not. The stats don't bear that out at all.
Right. There's actually no evidence to show that the death penalty deters criminals at all in states that have the death penalty versus states that don't. There's no positive correlation to crime rates. In countries where they've had the death penalty and then don't have the death penalty, there's no corresponding increase in crime rates there. Like you said, it's way more expensive to put someone on death row to execute them than it is to just, to keep them in prison, and that seems like, oh, well, it's just a money thing. Like it's not just a money thing, but it is a big thing.
Right. And what's interesting, too, is I think the reason it's not a deterrent is because the types of crimes that end up getting capital punishment are the kinds that are you're only committing those crimes when you're in a mental state such that you do not care about anything else beyond the present moment. It's these crimes of passion, so to speak.
Right. Most murderers aren't looking at,
oh, shucks, I don't want to get caught and killed. Yeah.
Looking at it from a rational point of view of, well, I have a this many % chance of getting caught, and if that happens, then these are the consequences, so I should take a while to weigh whether or not I think that committing this crime is it worth it, is it not worth it. Like that's not how it works.
Right. And especially for how many people would life in prison be even a worse punishment than death anyway, as far as just having your life. Now, where I would say there are probably countries where the death penalty is a deterrent is in some of these Southeast Asian countries where basically drug possession carries with it a death penalty.
Right. But then, and people will make that argument too. They'll say, well, the death penalty, sure, it's not a deterrent in America because it's so watered down. It takes years to get through all the appeals. And even then, a lot of those people will get off, or we don't allow even that many crimes to be punished by the death penalty anyway. And it's like, okay, well, then if you expand the death penalty and you make it more efficient, I guess, if that's the way you want to, like back in the 1800s where you were convicted and then hung the next day, that might be more of a deterrent, but you also are then killing more innocent people. You're executing more innocent people. Like that's what the appeals and stuff are there for. So yeah, I don't think that I mean that it would be more of a deterrent if you expand it to more crimes, but then
to lesser crimes, right?
But then you also are then executing more people.
Well, and then it becomes that's kind of cruel and unusual punishment. So okay, so someone's got a bag of weed, so you kill them. I mean that's not proportionate within the Constitution. And then actually the last thought on this is there was a Star Trek episode where there's kind of this utopia planet that they come across where any infraction is the death penalty. And so it becomes this controversy when they're visiting this planet. They don't fully understand that this is their custom. And Wesley's like chasing a ball and falls into some plants that were like roped off. He killed some of the plants by falling in there chasing a ball. And then the police come around and they arrest him. It's like, okay, well, we got to go execute him now. And it becomes a whole thing. Well, we're not from your planet. Anyway, so it kind of becomes a whole other thing with, but it was interesting too that this planet basically credited their whole peaceful society with the fact that every infraction was basically instant death penalty so that everyone was always on their best behavior. But again, to what extent was that actually for the best and everything? But anyway, that's not really an argument I'm trying to promote, but it did come to mind and kind of, I don't know, is related. But yeah, I think that's probably all we need to talk about here as far as the government's role in death and from euthanasia, assisted suicide to capital punishment. Again, we're not talking about historical events this week, but it is stuff I felt was very much worth addressing if we're kind of doing a larger story of the human story. And these are kind of topics we haven't really necessarily focused on yet. So thanks for listening. Next week, we'll kind of deal once again with Afghanistan in the 2007 film The Kite Runner.